Any questions? Since we will be recording today's webinar, by default, all attendees will be muted. You can use the chat function, raise your hand, or there's also a questions option at any time during today's webinar, and you can ask your questions there. And then at the end of the webinar, we'll also open up the floor to any questions that you might have and want to ask in person. So I'll be your presenter today. I'm Lindsay Needis. I'm a meteorologist and software support specialist at OneRain. Also on the line, we have Charles Yost, who will be moderating today's session and answering questions. He'll also have a few things to talk about at the very end with a sneak preview for our next webinar. So with that, let's go ahead and get started for today. So with data quality control in Contrail, we've got a lot of really great options for managing how your data comes in and is displayed. All data collected by our Contrail platform use an automated process, and each data record is checked and flagged with a quality flag after it is received and converted into its finished value. And in addition to that, Contrail will support ratings tables, text translations, all sorts of different things that you can use to give that raw data or finished data value additional meaning within Contrail. So today what we're going to do is walk through a few different, kind of some background on how things come in and are converted over. So we'll talk about how that process is from raw to finished data, looking at the conversion and validation processes that are in place and how you can get that configured in your own Contrail setup. We'll also walk through some options for adding ratings tables and what kind of use that has, as well as text translations, different ways to kind of audit your data and see where things might have been changed, all sorts of cool options. So let's go ahead, get started. And I guess, I've thrown around a couple terms like raw and finished values. So let's take a look at what that might actually mean for anyone who might be new to Contrail. So first I'm going to go ahead and find some data to look at. I think that looking at stage data will probably be our best bet. So let's get that loaded and let's take a look down here. So when you're looking at a data table, oftentimes you're going to see two different values listed over on the right-hand side. We have one value that's not in parentheses, has the units applied to it. This is what I'm referring to when I state that something is a finished value. This is the value after we have the conversion applied to the raw value that we receive. Now that raw value is the one in parentheses right here. That is the value that we receive in Contrail. However, that may be from an alert transmission, something that we pull from the USGS. Basically, this is the raw value is the source data. And so sometimes, like in this case, you can see that that raw value directly matches the finished value, which means that we didn't apply any conversion because it was already in the finished form. If you're familiar with alert data, you might know that that value comes in and it looks a little different. I'll see if I can find a quick example for y'all. All of these look like they're alert sites, or I'm sorry, USGS sites, so maybe not coming through in here. But in general, sometimes these values that we get, they don't necessarily match the finished value. The raw value doesn't match the finished value. And so by applying a conversion, we can bring that number to something that better meets our needs, kind of looks at it from an engineering value perspective, has some meaning for us. So with that, I'm going to now switch over to the administration side of Contrail so we can see, what that conversion process looks like. So up to administration, I'm a logged in user, and let's go ahead and find a sensor for an option. Actually, I'll go to the same one that we had been looking at just to kind of keep things uniform. And we were looking at stage. So great. Now, this is a similar view to what we were just looking at, but with a few extra details because we are on the administration side. And just scrolling down and looking at the panel here, we have one thing that's kind of pointing out to us the calibration. And this will give us a summary of what different options have been applied to make a conversion between that raw value, which is the one in parentheses again, to get it to that finished value. We can look here and in summary, this one's telling us, okay, there's no conversion. It's using the same value as the source. However, if I go up, I can click on the edit option and we can take a look and see what different things we can do with a calibration. So this conversion is currently marked as direct. Like I said, that's the no conversion, same value as the source. Other common ones that we see are the linear, which applies to your basic, algebraic equation of y equals mx plus b. It has the finished value is equal to the raw value times the slope plus the offset and the reference. So if I wanted to do something like that, and this is one of our most common ones really, the linear option, we can apply a slope value, which here it's defaulting to 0. In general, I recommend having a slope of at least 1, because if you have, I'm sorry, not at least 1, but you need a non-zero slope because the slope is a multiplier, and if we multiply by 0, our finished values will be 0. So, we need to have a slope, which is our multiplier in this case, and then offset and reference will be our additive values. Now, if we want to subtract a value from that, we would just add a negative sign in there with our number, and that would subtract 1 from that finished value to get that finished value. So other options in here, we've got options to do just an increment only measurement. We can apply an equation if we want to do some more advanced calculations other than our simple linear option. We've got table lookups. This is what we would use if we wanted to apply a ratings table. And we'll take a look at setting up a couple of these options a little bit more in depth in a few minutes. Time series sensors, equation tables, all sorts of different options you can really dive into to see how we want to convert that data. And this is great because oftentimes, you're receiving the data in one format and it doesn't really match the way that you want to present it. So anything that we can do to bring that into that final form is appreciated. So I'm going to leave this sensor. I'm not going to save my changes because it does need to still be set up as a direct sensor, but we'll go ahead, cancel, back out, and that will not apply any of the changes. So we've talked about kind of that first step in the form that we take for getting from raw to finished data, and that's applying that conversion between after it's received as raw data and then it becomes finished data. And then after all of that, what we do is there will be an automatic validation process that is applied to each individual data point as it is received into and marked down in the database. Validation is the application of a few different thresholds that we have that are configured by the system administrator. So here, looking through the data, we have the validation tags that are applied to each data point, which describe whether it is good data, whether it's bad data, and kind of give some context as to why it's been marked as such. So here we see this little green A underneath a lot of the data points. If we hover over it, it will give us a little bit more information. This one says it's good data, it's good. In general, any of them with the green and start with an A will be good, valid data. If it's marked as invalid data, I believe those tags will be like a light blue, a yellow, or a red. And kind of just scrolling through here at a glance, I'm seeing only good data, so that's not great for showing you examples, but we do have a list of all of the different quality tags and what that might entail up in the, if you go to help.onerain.com or look in the user manual, that will have a whole list. I'll pull that up for you real fast here. And so I'm looking at an article in our help page, data quality flag validation codes, and we can see there's a whole list of them here. A is good data, it passed everything. AN is also good, it starts a new sequence. Some bad ones or invalid data, sorry, I don't want to say it's bad data, it's still data that we see commonly would be ND, meaning that it failed the negative delta validation test, or PD means it failed the positive delta validation test. Otherwise, we see MN for minimum value, MX for maximum value, or even MM for maintenance mode. Those are the most common ones we see, but there are, as you can see, a few other ones than that. So how would we set those thresholds, those negative deltas, those positive deltas, all of that? That would be something that can be set either at the sensor level or at the sensor type level and set as a default for all sensors of that type. So first we'll go ahead and look at this from the sensor level, and then I'll go ahead and show you where we can do this as a sensor type so that the default is in place for everything of that type. So similarly to what we did for looking at the calibration and conversion, we'd go up to edit, but this time go to the drop-down menu next to it, and let's click validation. So here we have all of our different validation options. And there's a couple different things that we have for, what process do we want to call into play here. So we see under the validation panel here that it's currently marked as all standard validations performed. Basically, that means that it will apply the standard validation for looking at the value max and minimum, looking at the positive and negative deltas, applying the time, and there's nothing magic going on in the background. We're just doing a comparison across these. If we look at, there's also an option for all standard validations for alert sensors. Now, this is something that you would want to do pretty much only if you're using the alert protocol. If you're using alert 2, then you do want to still stick with all standard validations performed, the non-alert version. The alert version is special because it also adds a protection to make sure that all of the integer raw values that are received fall within the expected range. Remember, if you're using alert, the values that will be sent will fall between 0 and 2047, I believe, 2047. And so anything that falls outside of that range will not be considered as valid data because it can't actually be sent in that form. Other options, we have an ASCII alert rollover at 99. That works pretty similar to that all standard validations for alert sensors in that there's a rollover at a 99 value to just make sure that we're not cutting out the values necessary. I'll admit I haven't seen that one used so much, but that's still an option in place. And then we also have no validation checks, which means that there will be absolutely no validation performed. Typically, I don't recommend this one either. For the most case, you'll either apply the all standard validations performed or the all standard validations for alert sensors. Also in this panel, you'll see there's an option for allowing revalidation. Typically, I have this set to yes because we want to be able to go back and revalidate that data if there are any issues. This comes up if, we need to make changes to the conversion and apply that change to some historical data as well, or even if we're doing a rain reset at some of your rain accumulation sensors, we want to allow that revalidation. And there aren't too many cases that I can think of where you would want to not allow that, because that is a manual process where you have to go in and click a button. So with validation, we've got a couple different options for setting thresholds here. The first one is the value. This is a value max and a value min. And this refers to what finished value range is allowed. So for this particular stage sensor, the permitted values must fall between 0 feet and 50 feet. If the stage falls to a negative value, that will be marked as MX, and that will be invalid data. Same goes for if we were to get a value of 51 feet, that would be marked as, the minimum would be MN, and then the maximum would be marked as MX and marked as invalid. It would not show on graphs. It would not be taken into consideration for alarms, but it would still be shown in your data tables, and it is still kept in the database. We do not erase or delete invalid data. We just mark it as invalid so that we are aware that that probably isn't something that we want to take into consideration for operations. Now, in the next panel, we're looking at time. The time maximum right here refers to the amount of time after which a sensor will be marked as timed out. So you might have seen on a map the little gray triangles, or looking through a list of sites and sensors, a little alarm clock next to it, which means that the sensor is timed out. Timed out will mean that, for in this example, if this sensor has not received a valid data report in 1,440 minutes, which is also 24 hours or 1 day, then it will be marked as timed out. Time minimum refers to the interval at which data is allowed to be received in Contrail. So typically we have this set at 0. We want to be able to receive any data in Contrail regardless of how quickly it comes in. This is separate from our mechanism for looking at duplicate values, which comes into place kind of more on the back end. So this is just, to be honest, I don't mess with the time minimum too much because these settings are what works. However, sometimes with the time maximum, you want to have your sensor marked as timed out maybe later than 1 day, maybe sooner than 1 day. So that's where you would change that setting if you wished. Finally, we have the delta option in here, where this is what it describes the change between consecutive values, and this would help prevent any jumps or drastic falls in your data that might not necessarily be related to the data pattern. So for an example for you, let's say that at this stage site, we have a reading that's at 1 foot, and it's been reading around 1 foot for the last couple of days. Then let's say the next value that came in suddenly jumped to 10 feet. It was just 1 foot to 10 foot with no other reports in between. Well, in that case, that is a positive delta of 9 feet. That doesn't really sound like that would have actually happened in real life, to jump suddenly from 1 foot to 9 feet without any other reports in between. So in this case, this positive delta of 5 feet would mark that next data point as invalid, that 10-foot data point, because 9 is greater than 5. Now, let's say instead of a 1 to 9 feet, we had it increase from 1 to 1.2 feet. Well, that would be allowed because that 0.2 increase is less than 5 here. So that would not be marked as invalid. The same can be said for the negative delta. The negative delta is the same as the positive, but just in the other direction. It looks a little counterintuitive when you're looking at setting it up here, because it's both 5 and 5, but you don't need to put in the negative sign when we're describing the negative delta. We do that already for you on the back end. So at any time, you can make changes to these values, these settings here, and click Save when you're finished. One thing to note is anytime that you make changes to your validation settings or your conversion calibration settings, that will only impact the data from the moment you hit save and moving forward. We don't automatically apply those to anything retrospectively unless you will go ahead and revalidate that. And that will go ahead and reprocess the data using these new settings. So if you're going to do a revalidation, to apply those new settings, what you would do is down in the data panel here, there's a data button, and we want the drop down there. Opens up a menu, and then you'll see right in the middle is Revalidate. So let's say I made a change to our validation settings. I decided that our range just wasn't wide enough, and it was making an error and discounting some of the data that we wanted to keep in there. So what I could do is specify a start time. You know, when do I think that this should take place? Can go back a couple days, can go back a couple months. The further your range, the longer it will take to revalidate that data. That's something to keep in mind. Specify the end time. Do I want it to go right up until now, or do I want it to just be a specific range? Then I can also add a note. Why am I doing this? Well, okay, I changed the revalidation. Oh, I must have hit an extra button there. Or changed validation settings. And then I would go ahead and click save once I'm doing that. Now, I actually didn't change anything, so I'm not going to run this. But once we hit save, you'll be taken to a menu where it will describe, is this job processing? Is it complete? And then once it's done, you'll be able to go back and see that your data has updated. So I'm going to get started on a couple of examples. Charles, do we have any questions right now? All right, I don't see anything coming through. So
Sorry about that. Yeah, there's no questions.
All good.
Muted there.
Nope, I checked as well. We're good. So great. I know I've talked a lot about things in theory, but personally, I learn things best when I get to see how they're applied. So let's go through a couple of examples here. I'm going to switch to this site, and at this site, what I'm going to walk through is how we would go through and set up a ratings table. You can see here that there's already a flow rate in place, and this is one that's pulling flow rate directly from the USGS. And I also have a copy of the ratings table that should be used at this site. So let's go ahead and set up a sensor that way. So in general, setting up a new sensor, we go to the plus sign, and that brings us to our new sensor page. And I want to look and confirm first that the system is where this wants to be. The site is the site where I want to create this new sensor. Then I want to go ahead and specify what sensor type I want to use. In this case, it's going to be flow rate. And so by selecting that, it pre-populates all of the default settings for this particular sensor type in this system. Now, there is already a flow rate sensor at this site, so I'm going to add a little bit more where I specify flow rate from ratings table, just to kind of give it a little bit more context. Sensor ID, well, because this is going to be a synthetic equation using the ratings table, the sensor ID is a little bit more free-flowing. It's not quite so vital that that needs to match USGS standards. So I'm just going to call this flow ratings. Cool. So as I mentioned, this is going to be using the synthetic source type because we are going to be doing some sort of very basic calculation to create this data or to calculate this data. It's not directly coming from the USGS, so it's not going to be considered real source in this case. So the units, I'm good with it being cubic feet per second. The precision, that's fine, we can leave it as 0. The interval, now this is something that's come into Contrail relatively recently that you may run into. And right now the interval is, let's take this as your best guess at the frequency at which data will be received. This doesn't control when you see the data, nor does it really tie into any calculations at this time. So again, make this your best guess. We know that USGS reports at every 15 minutes. So let's leave this at 15 minutes here. Next bit, we want the time zone. So actually this is in Colorado, so we don't want this to be US Eastern. We want this to be US Mountain because USGS, you need the time zone to match the local time of that sensor. So for a ratings table then, this is where things start to differ from a few of the things I've got in place. For calibration, under conversion, for a ratings table, we want this to either be table lin log, or table log log. That depends on, how we're going to do the interpretation of the ratings table that we're going to apply. I'm going to keep it as pretty direct here, so we're just going to leave it as a table, ratings table lookup. In addition to having all of this, we can apply a slope, offset, and reference to further convert the values in place. So because my slope is 0, I'm going to change this to 1 just so that we do not kind of change that to a 0 value. So we're going to leave a slope of 1 here, but I don't want to have any additive values on that of an offset or a reference. So let's leave those be. Usually when I set up a new sensor, I also do a quick review of the validation settings just to make sure they kind of match what I'm expecting it for. And in this case, it looks like they're pretty wide open, with the maximum value being almost 10,000 CFS and the minimum value being 0. So that should be a pretty wide range. This is good when you're getting a sensor completely set up from scratch at the start, but then I recommend revisiting and kind of tuning that up to be a more reasonable range. With a wide range like this, it can be nice because you won't necessarily discount data that might have been actually valid data, but still fell outside of the criteria you selected. But the problem with having such a wide open range is that it also does permit data that might be invalid. So whereas this is nice for the initial setup, I definitely recommend that you revisit your sensors and make sure that they're tuned appropriately to what you would actually expect to be a reasonable maximum and a reasonable minimum. Same goes for your deltas here too. So I'm happy with the way this looks. Let's go ahead, click Save. And then the next thing that it's asking for me is to set up the source sensor for this data. So from a ratings table, what we're doing is we're looking at the stage data and we want to come up with flow data. So our source is going to be the stage data at this site. So I want to make sure that I select the correct site. That's going to be the Arkansas River. And then the stage sensor should be the source data. Then also here we have a couple of options to choose the source type. And the same menu will show up depending on however you're setting up any synthetic sensor. And in this particular case, I am going to select that the source type will be the finished values. Sometimes there may be cases where you want to use the raw value from the source, and those vary depending on what kind of a synthetic sensor you're setting up, what the source is, and what format that data all looks like. So I can't give direct guidance for each and every case, but if you have any questions on what's appropriate for your particular situation, please feel free to reach out to us and we can advise. Same goes for the source validation. So we can specify whether we want to use all collected data in this case or only valid collected data from that source sensor. By default, that will be only valid, and I'm going to leave that at the default here. So let's go ahead, click Save, and now we should have it connected so that it will actually use that data from the stage sensor. But you can see that we do have an error message that the sensor is defined to use the ratings table configuration, but there aren't any ratings configured. And that's because we still have at least one more step when we're setting this up, and that will be to upload our ratings table. So to do so, we're going to go to the Edit drop-down menu, and now you see there's an option for ratings. So let's click the ratings. And yep, as the warning message gave us, there are no ratings defined, so it doesn't know how to calculate the data. If we were to get data right now, it would be marked as, I'm sorry, that's the wrong sensor. If we were to get data for this sensor, it would be all marked as invalid with an IC for invalid conversion. And that's because we don't have this completely configured correctly. So it doesn't really know what we're supposed to do. Once we get a ratings table in here, it will be able to do that conversion and hopefully prevent any errors. So our next step is going to be to go to the import button, click it, and then we're going to find a file. So this is one thing that I didn't mention is I already have my ratings table already. In Contrail, we don't have a mechanism for creating and calculating ratings tables. Typically, that's something that your organization might already have on hand, or you send somebody out in the field to do a survey to get that information. So this is something that I already have on hand. So I'll go to Browse and find my download and open up my ratings table there. I know it's a CSV file, so I want it to be a comma delimited file here. Can also select tab as an option. Then we'll click upload. So I want to make sure that in my file, I guess what could be helpful is to look at what that file might look at like before we even bring it into Contrail. So I'm going to open that up for you real quick. Let's bring that over. So you can see that my CSV file here for the ratings table has only 2 columns and a header line. We want one header line labeled input and output for this particular type of import. And then the input is going to be the stage value, and the output will be what we want to map for that flow value. So we don't need any units, we don't want anything extra in there, just the value, comma, value. So now here under file, we want to match input to input, and same goes output to output. And it kind of gives us a little bit of a hint here too. The input needs to be the raw value, and that's going to be the stage. The output, here we can see it's the finished value, and that's going to be our flow value. So now that we've got those matched up correctly, we can see kind of a preview for what that looks like just to make sure we've got the right thing, and click Save. So now, where it previously said we didn't have anything set up, we've got a full ratings table in here where it says our input is going to be, if it's a stage reading of 4.71 feet, the appropriate output value will be 0.1 CFS. And also now you can see, okay, when was this last updated? Well, this was imported a few seconds ago. One thing I'm noticing here is our table starts at 4.71, and that sometimes is an error because, well, what if we get a reading for 4.7? That's not defined on this table, so that would result in an error and an invalid value. So I'm going to make a quick adjustment to this table and show you how we would go ahead and edit an existing ratings table. So unfortunately, it's a little roundabout, but we'll go ahead and do it. So first, what I'm going to do is download the existing ratings table by clicking the download button. Then, after I can confirm, okay, I see my download happened, it's right there, I'm going to go ahead and delete the existing ratings table. Yep, okay, it kind of warns me we're going to delete this. So let's click that. And now we don't have that there. So from the download that I just downloaded, I'm going to open that up, and we'll see it looks a little different now. There's some extra data that's been added into here. But what I want to do is add a row to kind of just make sure that we cover all of the bases. Because again, it starts at 4.71, and what happens if we get a reading that's below 4.71 feet? So I'm going to open this up, and we want to make sure that the site ID and the sensor ID match all of the existing ones. So I'm just going to copy and paste that in place. And then for my input, I'm going to type in 0 because I want to say, okay, well, if it's 0 feet for my stage, then what should my output be? Well, I'm going to say 0 there. And this is just me taking a best guess. You might know something, you might have something particular that your organization wants you to put in here, but by closing this range, we will then be able to kind of take a guess at what should happen between 4.71 feet and 0 feet and match that between 0 and 0.1 feet. So this is one thing that I typically add in if I know that my ratings table doesn't quite match all of the possible options. And this is something that comes up pretty frequently when we're looking at ratings table is we'll get, oh, I see that this is an invalid conversion, but my ratings table is correct. Well, oftentimes it just doesn't cover all of the bases of possibilities. So now that I've added that extra entry into the ratings table, I'm going to go back and go to File and Save As. I could copy the existing thing, but I'm going to just append on here, edited. So that way I know, yep, this is the one that I just made a change to. Great. So going back to Contrail, I'm going to click that import button again and browse to find the file. And where are we at? Yep, there we go. So the ratings table edited and upload. So now again, I want to match the input to the input, the output to the output, and click Save. So now what I see is the ratings table updated with that new entry that I put in there. If I go back to the sensor, I don't have new data in here yet because the USGS hasn't sent us new data for this particular sensor, but we'll check back in on this in a few minutes and see if we get some new data before this webinar is over. And hopefully what we'll see then is this populate with some new stage data converted over to flow data. So another thing that comes up with different conversions that we have is that sometimes the data that we receive isn't using the units that we want. And one example would be at this site where we're receiving water temperature in degrees Celsius. Now, I love metric units, but I'm not good at understanding what degrees Celsius means because I've been raised to know degrees Fahrenheit instead. So to me, this value doesn't necessarily hold a lot of meaning. So there's two different options we can take here, and that depends on if you want a record of the original data or if you want to have a completely separate sensor that, that has it in both ways. And so what we'll do first is the easier option where we just do a new conversion on the existing sensor so that instead of showing degrees Celsius, we'll show degrees Fahrenheit. And so for that, let's go ahead, we'll click into the water temperature sensor. And this has to do with the calibration, the conversion that's in place. When we look here, we have a conversion that has the same value as the source and it's still direct here. What we want to do is add in a linear conversion here that applies the conversion from degrees Celsius to degrees Fahrenheit. So that way this sensor will show it in degrees Fahrenheit rather than degrees Celsius. To do that, what we can do is go up to the Edit button. And with that, go down to the calibration. And here we would go and select linear instead. And for slope, this is one of those ones that I still need to look up. So we want to do Celsius to Fahrenheit. Oh, I'm a terrible speller, but thank goodness for autocorrect here. So here we see the formula, which is what I'm really looking for. So it's 9 divided by 5, and then add 0.3, add 32. So opening my calculator real quick, I want to figure out what the decimal is for 9 divided by 5. And that's 1.8. Got it. I kind of know these values, but I never remember them exactly. And by applying the wrong calibration values, that can end up with bad data. So our slope here, instead of 1, we want that to be 1.8. So we're going to multiply that raw value by 1.8, and then we're going to do an offset of 32, which will add 32. Kind of like this equation that we're looking at here, where we take, this is our raw value here in degrees Celsius, and this is 1.8 technically. So we're multiplying that by 1.8, and then we're going ahead and add 32 to arrive at a finished value in degrees Celsius. I'm sorry, degrees Fahrenheit, wow. So here, again, 1.8, 32, reference of 0. So then I could go ahead, click Save, and like I said before, just making an update on your calibration will only impact the data that will be received from this point forward. If I want to apply this to historical data, what I would have to do is revalidate. So in this case, I'm just going to revalidate and go over the last day here. And we'll look at, adding a note, updated to Fahrenheit. And click Save. So now this will go and revalidate. So it's pending. If I reload the page, it's processing that job already now. So then let's do one more where we reload. And now it says it's complete. So if I go back to water temperature, we'll see, well, now we've got a few issues because I didn't complete all of the correct steps here. But in general, what you'll see is this is now a value that, despite what the units say, this value is degrees Fahrenheit instead of degrees Celsius. Now, there's a few things that I didn't do that kind of impact the display here. One is that it still says it's degrees Celsius instead of degrees Fahrenheit, and that's because I didn't change the units. If I go to edit, I can change the units here, and changing the units is not the same as changing the calibration. This just is a label here. So if I do that, I can click save, and that does take instantaneously. So we now say, okay, it's at least displaying as 62.6 degrees Fahrenheit. The other thing here is that we have a validation issue. It says that we are surpassing the allowed maximum value, so these points are all being marked as invalid. What I would need to do then is go to the validation settings and check this out. So our value max is only to 60 degrees because previously this was set up as a sensor for Celsius, and 60 degrees Celsius is very, very hot. But 60 degrees Fahrenheit is, it's warm, but it's not excessive. So what we would want to do instead is set this value to something higher. So let's do 140 degrees Fahrenheit, because I know that that is also very, very hot. So we'll leave that at that, click save. And again, like I said, because that won't take instantaneously, I'm going to do another revalidation just to make sure that we get this right. So let's go again, drop down menu, revalidate. I'm going to leave it over the last day because that was the same range as what we did previously, and updated validation as a note to myself so I know why I changed the data. And let's click save. So we've got it pending. If I refresh, kind of takes a while. We've got some processing. I'm impatient, so I usually hit the reload button a bunch. And now it's complete because this was a relatively short period over which we revalidated. So if I go back to the sensor, we'll see now that's all updated. It is valid again. And we can see that, yep, okay, great, this is awesome. And this kind of further highlights what I was showing before, in that the raw value doesn't always match the finished value depending on what kind of conversion factor we have in place here. So I'm going to take a pause for a second. Does anybody have any questions about what we've covered up to this point?
I think we're good, Lindsay.
Awesome. So then a couple final things I want to cover here. We've got different, let's see, so that's good there. Let's take a step back, and one thing that always comes up when we talk about kind of these revalidations, because I've kind of done a few of those now, is we're coming up on the time in which some folks would be doing a RAIN revalidation. So let me show you where that lives as an option if we're coming up on the end of your RAIN year. So what we need to do first is I'm going to show you two different options. One is the sensor by sensor option, and then we'll look at kind of the shortcut and the faster option there. So we need to find a RAIN accumulation sensor. I'm going to sort out by sensor type. And let's look at, well, are there no RAIN accumulation sensors here? Okay, there's one for me. Excellent. It just took me a change in my views. So here we're looking at a rain accumulation sensor that's looking at accumulated precipitation over the course of a year. So what we can do is go under it's not under the data dropdown, excuse me, it's under the edit dropdown. See, I don't perform this one very commonly either, so this is why I thought that I'd go through a refresher here. We go edit dropdown. Okay, well, maybe I don't know what I'm doing. In general, it would be under one of the drop-downs. So let me see if I can find another option for an accumulation sensor that will actually have this. Oh, I see what I'm doing. So that makes better sense to me. All right, so we're going to hold on that demonstration just because I didn't prepare myself with an example in advance. But in general, what there is there's a drop-down where you have a rain accumulation sensor option, and it has a rain reset button. And you would click that button and specify the date from which the rain reset should take place. Rain resets cannot be scheduled in advance. They have to take place the day of or after the fact. Only, unfortunately, we can't do scheduling with this one yet. So you would specify what date you want to start from 0 again. And then from there, you would also specify the time zone in which that sensor collects, not necessarily the time zone you're in right now, but for that specific sensor, whether that's UTC or local time. And then you would be able to click save. And then what it does from there is it inserts a 0 value at midnight of the day that you specified and revalidates from that point. So that way your rain accumulation sensor will start from 0. I'm having an issue here in that I'm looking at HADS sensors, and HADS is a little different because HADS does their rain accumulation and their rain resets before we even get the data. So that's why I'm not able to find it where we're looking right now. And so in one of our upcoming webinars, we'll go ahead and walk through those steps. I know many folks will do a rain reset closer to October 1st or even January 1st. So I jumped the gun on my timing a little bit here. I apologize for any inconvenience on that, and we'll come back to this in a future webinar. Now, there were a couple things that I said that I'd kind of loop back on that I haven't yet. So one of those is different log options and reporting options for tracking changes in your data, data quality, all of that sort of a thing. So I'm going to go back to that sensor. Here we go. I've made a couple changes at this water temperature sensor, and it did have some instances where it was marked as invalid data. So this would be a good example. So both at the level of the administration, where we can look at the entire system, or at a sensor by sensor level, we can look at logs to see what's happened in a particular case. So if I go to that data menu again and do the drop down, scrolling down a little bit, you'll see we've got a couple different options for logs here. So the first one is an audit log, and this looks at the changes that have been made to data so that we can kind of see what's happened. And this also will track duplicate values, invalid. Sometimes if you have the time zone misconfigured and you're receiving data way in the future, you can see that in the audit log as well. So here, what we can see is that original data point that we received. It says here that it's still the 17 degrees. And so this indicates that there was a change made to bring it and revalidate it from that original 17 degrees into the 62 degrees Fahrenheit that we're displaying. Other options for logs, if we scroll down, there's also a change log. So that would show if we made a manual change or deleted out a data point. And data can be manually changed if we go ahead and click that data button. And that opens up a list where we can click the finished value and make a change to the finished value, click the check mark and save that. Technically, you can change the raw value. I need to emphasize this in that we do not recommend you change the raw value. In some cases, this can muck up the trail that we're following. And with things like rain accumulation, which is oftentimes it's a tip count, it doesn't really have the effect that one anticipates. So whereas you can technically change the raw value, I don't recommend that you change the raw value. You can also, however, change the validation setting here, where we click on it again, pick the option from a list, click the check mark, and that will save that value then. Also see kind of just a few hints here, 1 update, 0 duplicate values. We can also delete a data point or add an annotation to a data point. So if I had made any changes there, that would show up on the change log that's underneath that data menu. The validation log, that one will show some things. This is, okay, well, what validation jobs or revalidation jobs were run? And that's why I like to add notes here, because I can see, well, that's why I did it over that period. I updated the validation for that. We can see the status of it, when that finished up, as well as who initiated that process. Then that was kind of looking at a sensor by sensor basis. If we want to take a look over a full system, we can go to reporting and logs to see a lot of that same information. Here I can click the audit menu, or it's going to take a minute to load. And this looks at audits over all of the different sensors and sites within the view or system that you have selected here. So we can see a lot of different things happening here. We've got St. Petersburg, the heat index sensor. We see a couple of different entries, and I believe that's actually because this sensor is an equation sensor with multiple different variables. And so each time a new variable reports, it updates that equation a little bit more. So we see all of those different entries in the audit log here. We can also look at the change log across the full Contrail system. And if I change the system to USGS here, well, actually, I didn't make any changes manually, so that's why we're not seeing anything here. And then same goes for interpolation, validation. And these are all great for taking a look at what's been done across the full system. My final thing is there are a couple of reports that you can use to keep track of your validation and calibration information, especially if you're trying to make your sensors consistent across the board with their validation and calibration settings. So I'm just going to start typing out for the validation option, and we can see sensor validation by system and sensor validation by view, both of which are ones that I use pretty frequently. Typically, I'll actually go by system rather than by view when I'm looking at calibration or validation, because we do have the option to make changes at the sensor type level and update from there. So this one, I'll select system real fast and show you what this one looks like. And this will give you a summary of all of the sites, sensors, what validation levels, even, what their last value was, how close is their last value to getting to that maximum value, to let you know, okay, is this what I should have that value at? Same goes for positive deltas, negative deltas, and that information. We also do have a similar report for sensor calibration. So we can take a quick look at that. I'll choose one that we've already run. And here we go. We can see a list of the sites, the sensors, what are they using for time zones, their slope, their offset, what conversion are they using. And this is great for tracking down any errors that might be in there for your calibration and your conversion settings, making sure that all of them are using the appropriate calibrations and conversions. And this is sometimes an easier option if you're trying to look at a whole list and identify the outliers rather than clicking into each individual site and sensor to check it out that way. So that wraps up what I'd like to talk about today. We will open up the floor for questions in just a moment. I appreciate your time and joining us today. And I would like to turn the floor over to Charles for a second to give a sneak preview of one of our upcoming bonus webinars that's coming up in conjunction with our sister company, High Sierra Electronics.
Thanks, Lindsay. We have, as you mentioned, we have we're doing special webinar series throughout the last couple months. And we have one next week where we will be presenting on dam safety. OneRain and High Sierra have extensive experience providing dam safety solutions and have lots of experience in this area. And I know a lot of our customers have one or two areas that they're wanting to either monitor or better understand. So we're going to have a free webinar next week where we will be talking about reducing risk of maybe a reservoir or a dam that you might have with some real-time monitoring best practices. These are best practices that we've learned over the years that can help you reduce your risk for operating or being responsible for a dam. So please check that out. Same mechanism on our website or High Sierra's website to sign up for that and get an invite for that. Will be a very informative presentation. Lindsay, we do have one last question. We have 2 minutes here. We have a question that says, is there a way to quickly identify any sensor values where data quality is not approved?
Yes,
is there
actually,
a mapped way to look at all of the values that are failing validation?
So yes and no. There isn't one for all of the values that are failing, but if you've got an idea of the type of fail, or sorry, that's not very specific, and I'll show you exactly what I mean. So I'm going to go into the admin side and look at reporting and go down to the logs. So from here, I'm going to take a look at my data log, and I can look at a specific view or system, and here we can sort out by data quality here. So for example, if I wanted to look for sensors that are falling below the minimum value, I can select the minimum value option, and I can see, well, in my all sites view, there is no data in the last 24 hours that goes under that point. We can check out another one. Let's see if we get anything for MX. Okay, well, not quite here, but if there was anything in the last 24 hours to look at that, we could do that. Sometimes there are some reports, and we can talk about custom reporting options depending on if you're in Contrail cloud server or on a locally hosted Contrail base station. We can potentially help with devising reports that would help identify that information, where you could run a report on demand to obtain that information. So if that's something you're interested, please reach out to us at contrail.support@onerain.com, and we can look into if that's a valid option for your deployment.
Okay, and that's all the questions that we have. If anybody else has any questions, feel free to send them in the chat.
And I'll hang out online for another couple of minutes just to see if there's anything going on. Otherwise, if something comes up a little bit later that you want to ask us, go ahead, email us at contrail.support@onerain.com. That will reach both Charles and myself, or you can give us a call and we can talk a little bit more on the phone about what you're looking for.